number of my thoughts are quite similar to those that Alan was mentioning, also fit in with what Mark was talking about. I think the research agenda needs to reflect an understanding of the different roles that SMEs have. And my thoughts were actually just to explore around that rather than having a list on research, because I think there tends to be this traditional, rather old-fashioned model of SMEs in innovation. That you have the guy in the shed, usually a guy in a shed, isn't it? Don't usually get women in sheds. A guy in a shed working out something, doing a startup product, innovative product, develops a design to launch, hasn't got the money to actually see it through commercially, sells it off or is predated by a large organisation who then has the resources to fully exploit it. There seems to be a rather oversimplistic view of the role of SMEs. But for sustainable enterprise, we've got a much wider set of roles in sustainable innovation. And I think we need to understand these roles and understand where research then fits into that. Yeah, you have got those in production and services, but they struggle with the models of big enterprise. And I think that's where we've been talking about struggles with the trade associations, also with the regulatory framework, which is all set up around the way big organisations do innovation, which tends to be in a rather lumbering, slow form, and is not particularly innovative. But I think one thing about research is that there are actually some SMEs who are developing different models to those of the big enterprises, and that is a fascinating area. So, for example, in our work on electric vehicle development, which is based on a local partnership here, we were having a look at the River Simple fuel cell car system. Now, this is a small company based on motorsports expertise, trying to take on the big boys in an enormous key technology, which is vastly expensive. And how are they doing it? They're actually taking the big boys on by developing an innovative process. They're using the internet, they're using open source, they're using sort of crowdsourcing to actually speed up and provide resource for the small company for their R&D. They are actually an internet culture company. So rather than protecting their intellectual property rights, they're making them freely available on an open source basis, doing exactly the opposite of the big boys in the game. They have found a different business model of doing it. Which company is actually going to have fuel cell vehicles first out to trial next year? It's going to be River Simple, not the big manufacturers, who are still talking about perhaps we'll have them for 2030. So SMEs are actually a source of innovative business models. This was a theme that's come around. And these innovative business models might be better for sustainable enterprise than the traditional ways that the big companies work. But then, and this is a point that Mark picked up, secondly, sustainable enterprise for adoption and diffusion, for uptake. This is an incredibly important area, and it's an area where SMEs have to build up something that they often have difficulty with, which is the relationships with larger enterprise, with larger suppliers, with larger service systems. But we have got niches emerging here, and this is almost with Mark's evolutionary one, of where you've actually got a whole variety of SMEs working. I happen to buy biodiesel from waste oil from a local social enterprise around here in Milton Keynes. It was actually set up by the churches. It's part of Milton Keynes Christian Foundation. But they are actually collecting waste oil from local restaurants, processing it, making it available. And they, incidentally, were some of the people that helped set up the initial household recycling systems here. There are other innovative organisations around. And again, they're working to probably quite a different sort of model. SMEs for customisation. are actually another important SME role. And I think identifying the different roles of SMEs helps to identify the research questions that are involved. Many of these SMEs have relationship issues with larger business partners. They have difficulties of access to capital. They have difficulties of churn of staff, of difficulties with access to knowledge and information retrieval systems. So there are research issues that follow on from that. A thing that Mark picked up very important is the role of SMEs for information and enabling. Now, very often we talk about an information enabling role for sustainability as something the state does. It's a thing, Energy Savings Trust and so forth is involved. You set up websites and you do your public engagement. But actually, the role of SMEs as intermediaries within the system can be very important. It's a traditional role that consultants have held, but it's a role where actually companies can actually do that quite well. I think Mark's 2 degrees example was a very good one, and I won't dwell on that. But when you're into a role of intermediaries, then it is again a very different research agenda that occurs. So I think for research, I think we need to recognise that SMEs are not one-size-fits-all and a single function. SMEs have a very important role. They operate differently to larger organisations, and there is a real danger of saying we want to get the SMEs to behave like the big boys. I think that is a frightening danger. And perhaps an important thing about research is saying we want to get perhaps the big boys to behave a bit more like SMEs. Perhaps, that might be one question, perhaps not. But it is actually understanding the way in which they function and operate in order to be able to provide research results that actually are of relevance to them. And too often you come to the SMEs with a research agenda which is set up by the public policy, or, as Mark was pointing out, has been formulated by the large players. And of course it's of no relevance to them, but they're doing a lot of extremely powerful, important stuff. So let's try and get our research to focus on the SME view of life and the SME role, rather than a public policy or a large organisational role. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.